Welcome. Tonight, we step quietly into a small bakery in Paris during the early hours of the night, long before the streets begin to stir. Inside the workroom, the air holds the familiar sense of flour, yeast, and warm brick. A single oil lamp hangs near the work table, casting a soft circle of light across the wooden surface, and the tools resting there. The baker has already arrived. While the city sleeps, he begins the quiet work that fills the hours before morning. Tending the oven, preparing the flour, mixing and shaping the dough that will slowly rise in the warmth of the room. In this story, nothing urgent will happen. There are no sudden sounds, no voices, and no demands for your attention. You can simply listen as the work unfolds. The steady rhythm of hands pressing dough, the soft scrape of tools against wood, the quiet warmth of the oven gradually returning to life. The night remains still beyond the bakery walls, and inside, the slow work of bread continues. The door closes behind him with a sound like a sigh. Wood meeting wood, the latch sliding into place with a soft metallic click that seems louder in the silence than it would at any other hour. The street beyond is quiet. There are no voices, no footsteps on the cobblestones, only the occasional distant sound of something he cannot identify, muffled and far away, belonging to a world that does not reach into this space. He stands for a moment with his back to the door, letting the darkness settle around him. The workroom is completely black, and he cannot see the shapes of things. He can only sense them through memory. The work table somewhere ahead, the cupboard against the far wall, the oven to his left occupying the space it has always occupied. The air smells of flour, that dry, faintly sweet scent of grain ground fine, and beneath it the smell of old heat, of bricks that have been fired and cooled countless times, and the sharp, living smell of yeast, faint but present, woven into the fabric of the room itself. He reaches into his pocket, and his fingers find the matchbox, small and rectangular, the wood smooth under his thumb. He draws it out and slides it open, the wood rasping softly, and he takes a single match between his fingers, feeling the rough head, the slender stick. He closes the box and strikes the match against its side in one quick motion. The flame blooms at the tip of the match, small and golden, and the sudden brightness makes him narrow his eyes for a moment. The light reaches only a short distance, illuminating his hands, the match between his fingers, and a small circle of floor at his feet. Beyond that circle, the darkness remains, but he can see enough now to move forward, stepping carefully toward where he knows the lamp hangs on its hook near the work table. The lamp is an oil lamp, its glass chimney catching the matchlight as he approaches, and he lifts it down with his free hand, feeling its weight, the metal cool against his palm. He removes the chimney and sets it aside on the table, then touches the match to the wick. The flame catches, spreads along the woven cotton, and begins to burn with a steady, quiet light. He replaces the chimney, and the light strengthens, protected now, and he hangs the lamp back on its hook where it can cast its glow across the room. The darkness retreats. The workroom reveals itself slowly. The long wooden table with its surface worn smooth. The tall cupboard with its closed doors. The row of hooks where aprons hang in motionless folds. The tools on the table become visible. The wooden peel with its long handle, the scrapers, the linen cloth folded into quarters and dusted white with flour, the nested bowls. The sacks of flour stand against the wall, their canvas surfaces sagging slightly with weight. And the great mass of the oven where it occupies the left wall, its bricks dark in the lamplight, its mouth a deeper darkness within the darkness, the iron door leaning beside the opening. He can smell the scent of it even from here. Ash and spent wood, and the distinct smell of brick that has held fire. He crosses to the oven and stands before it, looking into the shadowed opening. The interior is warm. He can feel it from where he stands. A gentle warmth that speaks of heat retained, of embers that have not yet died completely. He kneels and extends his hand into the opening, palm facing the oven floor, and the warmth touches his skin more directly now, radiating from the bricks, from the ash-covered floor where yesterday's fire burned. He reaches for the iron poker that leans against the wall and extends it into the oven, stirring the ash gently. Beneath the gray layer, embers glow faintly orange when disturbed, a barely visible heat that pulses in the darkness. He gathers them toward the center with small movements of the poker, consolidating what remains, and then he rises and moves to the corner where kindling rests in a wooden box. The kindling is dry, thin pieces of wood that snap cleanly when broken. He selects several pieces and carries them to the oven, kneeling again, placing them carefully atop the gathered embers. The wood settles with soft sounds, and he watches as the heat begins to reach into it, as the first thin wisps of smoke rise and curl in the still air inside the oven's mouth. He moves to the tall sacks that stand against the wall beneath the high, shuttered window, their canvas surfaces sagging slightly with the weight of what they hold. The first sack is flour. He knows this without reading any marking, knows it by the way it sits, by the particular slump of the fabric, by the faint, dusty halo that surrounds its base where flour has sifted through the weave and settled on the floor in a pale ring. He unties the cord that gathers the mouth of the sack, working the knot loose with his fingers, feeling the rough hemp against his skin, and then he folds back the canvas, revealing the flour within. It is pale, almost white in the dim light, smooth on its surface where it has settled during the night. He reaches in with the tin scoop that hangs on a nail driven into the wall beside the sacks, feeling the metal cool in his palm, and he draws out a measure of flour, watching as it pours from the scoop in a soft stream. Silent and weightless, falling into the wide, shallow bin he has carried from the cupboard and set on the floor beside the sacks. The bin is wooden, worn pale on its interior, and the flour accumulates in it slowly. He continues dipping into the sack, lifting and pouring, the motion becoming rhythm, becoming repetition. Each scoop holds roughly the same amount, though not precisely, and he does not count them. He simply continues until the bin holds what looks right, what feels right, a judgment made not with numbers but with the eye's assessment of volume, of proportion, of the relationship between the bin's depth and the height of flour within it. When the bin seems full enough, he pauses. He sets down the scoop and lifts the bin with both hands, feeling its weight, testing it. The flour shifts slightly as he moves, and he tilts the bin just barely to one side, watching the surface, watching how the flour responds to the angle. Then he sets it down again and reaches for the scoop once more, adding 2 more measures, the flour falling in its soft stream, building the level higher by perhaps an inch. He ties the mouth of the flour sack closed, the cord sliding through his fingers as he pulls it tight, and then he turns to the shelf where the yeast waits in its ceramic crock, cool to the touch, the lid fitting close. He removes the lid, setting it aside with a faint scrape of ceramic on wood, and he looks down at the yeast inside. Pale blocks of it, firm and slightly crumbly, giving off that sharp, living smell that cuts through the dustier scents of the room. He breaks off a piece, feeling it crumble slightly under the pressure of his fingers, the texture somewhere between clay and chalk, cool and faintly damp. The piece is perhaps the length of his thumb, perhaps slightly more, and he sets it on a small wooden board that rests on the work table. Then he breaks off another piece, this one smaller, and then a third, building a small pile of yeast fragments, their edges irregular, their surfaces showing the grain of the compressed material. He returns the lid to the crock, the ceramic meeting ceramic with a soft sound, and he carries the board with its pile of yeast to the corner of the work table, setting it down near the edge where it will be within easy reach. Then he goes to the buckets that stand near the door. 2 of them, both filled with water drawn the evening before and left to sit through the night, to settle, to come to the temperature of the room. He dips his hand into the first bucket, feeling the water close around his fingers, around his wrist. It is cool, but not cold. He holds his hand submerged for a long moment, letting his skin register the sensation, and then he withdraws it, water dripping from his fingers back into the bucket, with soft tapping sounds that echo faintly in the bucket's interior. He goes to the second bucket and does the same, testing, comparing, though the water in both buckets is nearly identical in temperature, differing only by the faintest degree that his hand can barely detect. He chooses the second bucket, the choice made for reasons he could not articulate, some subtle quality of feel, of intuition, and he carries it to the work table, setting it down beside the bowl he has nested out from the others, the one whose interior is cleanest, whose dried residue is thinnest. The scrapers and linen cloth wait where they were left. The bins of flour wait on the floor, the surface of the flour smooth and undisturbed. The yeast waits on its board, the pieces irregular and pale. The water waits in the bucket, its surface reflecting the lamplight in a barely visible shimmer. He stands at the work table, his hands resting lightly on its surface, and he looks at what he has arranged, at the components gathered, at the space between them. He lifts the bucket and tilts it over the bowl, watching as the water pours out in a smooth column, filling the bowl halfway, the water pooling and settling, its surface becoming still. He sets the bucket down and reaches for the yeast on its board, taking the largest piece between his fingers and dropping it into the water. It floats for a moment, pale against the darker water, and then he presses it down with his fingertips, feeling it soften under the pressure, feeling it begin to dissolve, releasing small cloudy tendrils that spiral through the water like smoke. He breaks the yeast apart under the surface, crumbling it between his fingers, working it against itself until the solid pieces become smaller, become fragments, become a suspension of particles that turn the water milky and opaque. His fingers move slowly, methodically, finding each piece and reducing it, finding the next and doing the same, until there are no lumps remaining, only the clouded water with its sharp, yeasty smell rising into the air. He reaches for the bin of flour, tilting it toward the bowl, and he begins to pour. The flour falls in a pale stream, hitting the surface of the water and spreading, some of it sinking immediately, some of it floating in delicate rafts that gradually absorb moisture and slip beneath. He pours steadily, watching the ratio change, watching the water disappear under the accumulating flour. And when perhaps a third of the bin has emptied into the bowl, he sets it aside and reaches into the bowl with his hand. The mixture is loose, more like wet sand than dough. He stirs it with his fingers, feeling flour and water combine, feeling the yeast distribute itself through the mass. The texture changes as he works. What was separate becomes unified. What was dry becomes damp. What was liquid becomes absorbed. He adds more flour, a handful at a time, taking it from the bin and sprinkling it over the surface of the mixture, then folding it in with his hand, pressing and turning, pressing and turning. The dough begins to come together. It is rough and shaggy, clinging to his fingers in wet clumps. But there is the beginning of structure now, the beginning of something that holds its own shape. He turns it out onto the work table, the mass landing with a soft, heavy sound, and he scrapes the bowl with his other hand, gathering the bits that cling to the sides and adding them to the pile. The table is cool under his palms. He presses the dough flat, feeling it resist, feeling it push back against his hands with a gentle, yielding pressure. Then he folds it over itself, gathering one edge and bringing it to the center, pressing down, feeling the layers compress. He turns the mass a quarter turn and repeats the motion, pressing, folding, turning. The dough is sticky and it clings to the table surface, leaving streaks of itself behind, thin films that catch the light. He reaches for the bin of flour and takes a small handful, scattering it across the table in a fine dusting. The white powder settling on the dark wood, on the dough, on his hands. The flour creates a separation between dough and wood, and when he presses again, the dough releases more easily, though it remains tacky, remains slightly adhesive. he continues the motion. Press, fold, turn. Press, fold, turn. His shoulders move with the rhythm of it. His weight shifts from one foot to the other as he leans into each press, as he gathers the dough and folds it. The dough begins to change under his hands. What was rough becomes smoother. What was sticky becomes more coherent. The surface that was torn and ragged begins to show a faint sheen, a suggestion of the gluten strands forming within, aligning, creating structure. He adds more flour to the table surface when the dough begins to stick again, just a small amount, dusting his palms and sprinkling the rest across the working area. The flour mixes with the moisture from the dough, creating tiny beads of paste that roll under his hands, that gather in the creases of his palms, that he scrapes away periodically with the wooden scraper, the accumulated paste falling to the table in small, damp clusters. The motion becomes automatic. His hands know what to do without thought directing them. Press the dough flat and feel it spread under his palms. Feel the warmth of it. Warmer now than when he began. Warmed by the friction of working, by the heat of his hands. Fold the far edge toward the center. Press it down. Seal the fold with the heel of his hand. Turn the mass clockwise, just a quarter turn, so that what was the side is now the front. Press again. He gathers the dough into a rough ball, his hands cupping it, shaping it without pressing too firmly, and he sets it to one side of the table near the edge. Then he returns to the bowl, to the bin of flour, to the bucket of water. He pours water into the bowl again, the same amount or near enough, the water filling the bowl to the same level as before. He reaches for the board where the remaining yeast waits, 2 pieces smaller than the first, and he drops them both into the water, pressing them down, crumbling them between his fingers, watching the water cloud and turn milky. He adds flour pouring from the bin, watching it fall and accumulate. He mixes with his hand, feeling the combination happen again, the separate elements becoming one. He adds more flour, folding it in, and when the mixture begins to cohere, when it pulls away from the sides of the bowl in a rough, shaggy mass, he turns it out onto the table beside the first piece of dough, and he begins again. Press, fold, turn. Press, fold, turn. His hands move through the same sequence, the same rhythm. The second piece of dough transforms under his hands just as the first did. Rough becoming smooth, sticky becoming cohesive, formless taking shape. He dusts the table with flour when needed, scrapes away the paste that accumulates, continues the pressing and folding, the steady, repetitive motion that asks nothing but continuation, but presence, but the weight of his hands and the rhythm of the work. He reaches for the first piece of dough, the one that has been resting at the edge of the table, and he draws it toward the center of the workspace. The surface has dried slightly where it was exposed to the air, forming a thin skin that yields when pressed, that stretches rather than tears. He presses the dough flat with his palms, spreading it into a rough oval, feeling the resistance as the gluten pulls against the stretching, and then he takes the wooden scraper and draws it through the center of the mass, dividing it. The cut is not precise. The blade moves through the dough with slight resistance, the soft interior compressing slightly before separating, and the two halves are not exactly equal in size, one slightly larger than the other by perhaps the width of 2 fingers. He sets the smaller piece aside and takes up the larger one, weighing it in his hands, feeling its mass, its density. Then he sets it down and reaches for the scraper again, dividing the larger piece once more, adjusting the division so that the 2 resulting pieces feel more similar in weight when he lifts them. He takes one of these pieces and begins to shape it. His hands cup the dough, fingers curving around it, and he pulls it across the table surface toward himself, the bottom of the dough dragging slightly against the wood, creating tension in the outer layer, creating a taut skin that gathers on top. He rotates the piece a quarter turn and pulls again, the motion smooth and practiced, the dough responding by tightening, by forming itself into a rough sphere. He repeats this several times, and with each repetition the dough becomes rounder, more contained, the surface growing taut and smooth. When the shape satisfies him, he sets the piece on the linen cloth that he has spread across one end of the table, the cloth dusted lightly with flour so the dough will not stick. The shaped piece sits there, holding its form, and he returns to the table for the next piece, beginning the same sequence of movements. His hands cup and pull, creating tension. The dough drags across the table surface. He rotates it, pulls again, feeling the resistance, feeling the skin tighten. The rhythm is the same as it was for the first piece, and the result is the same. A rounded form with a taut surface set on the cloth beside the first, spaced perhaps a hand's width away. He reaches for the smaller piece he set aside initially and divides it as well, the scraper moving through the dough, creating 2 more portions. These are slightly smaller than the first 2, less regular in their division, but he shapes them with the same motions, the same cupping and pulling, the same rotation and tension. They join the others on the cloth, arranged in a loose row, their spacing uneven but adequate, leaving room for what will come next. The second piece of dough waits where he left it, and he brings it forward, pressing it flat, dividing it with the scraper. The blade moves through the dough with that same soft resistance, and he adjusts the divisions, weighing the pieces in his hands, making small corrections, removing a bit from one and adding it to another, pressing the seams together so they merge and become one piece again. He shapes these portions as he shaped the others, forming spheres that hold themselves upright when placed on the cloth. His hands move through the motions without hesitation, without pause for consideration. The knowledge is in the hands themselves, in the muscles and tendons, in the skin that has performed these movements countless times, and knows how much pressure to apply, how far to pull, and when to stop. The cloth grows more crowded. He adjusts the spacing of the earlier pieces, sliding them carefully across the floured surface, making room for the new additions. Some of the pieces have begun to relax slightly, their taut surfaces softening, their shapes spreading just barely as the gluten within releases some of its tension. He lifts one that has spread too much and shapes it again, pulling and rotating, restoring the tightness, and then he returns it to its place on the cloth. The wooden board that leans against the wall near the cupboard, he lifts it now and carries it to the table, setting it beside the cloth. The board is dusted with flour from previous use, a thin coating that has dried and adhered to the wood, and he adds more, scattering it across the surface with his palm. He takes several of the shaped pieces from the cloth and transfers them to the board, spacing them with his fingers, adjusting their positions so they sit evenly, so the distances between them are roughly equal. His hands return to the remaining dough. There's more to divide, more to shape. The scraper moves through the mass. His hands cup and pull. The shaped pieces accumulate on the cloth, on the board, their surfaces smooth and taut, their forms rounded and contained, waiting in their rows. He kneels before the oven mouth, his weight settling onto the floorboards, and he looks into the shadowed interior where the kindling rests atop the gathered embers. There is light inside now, though it is faint, a dim orange glow that comes from beneath the wood, from the spaces between the pieces where embers touch and share their heat. The glow does not flicker with flame, not yet, but pulses gently with the movement of air, with the slow consumption of what remains from yesterday's fire. He reaches for the poker and extends it into the oven, touching it to one of the kindling pieces that has settled at an angle, leaning against another. The wood has darkened where it meets the embers, and a thin trail of smoke rises from the contact point, pale gray and nearly invisible in the dim light. He lifts the piece slightly with the poker, creating a gap beneath it, allowing air to pass through the space, and then he withdraws the tool and sets it aside. The warmth from the opening touches his face, his hands, but it is gentle, not intense. He extends his palm toward the interior again, holding it there, feeling the heat that radiates from the bricks, from the floor where ash has been swept aside to expose the surface beneath. The warmth is present but measured, the kind that would be comfortable to remain near indefinitely. He shifts his position, lowering himself further so he can see the floor of the oven more clearly, and he notices a small accumulation of ash near the front edge, a pile that has formed where his earlier stirring pushed it. He reaches for the poker again and draws the ash toward the opening, pulling it out onto the brick apron that extends beyond the oven mouth. The ash is light, fine as powder, and some of it rises into the air as he moves it, drifting in small clouds before settling again on the floor, on his hands, on the fabric covering his knees. There is an iron grate set into the base of the oven, partially visible through the remaining ash, and he uses the tip of the poker to clear the openings, scraping gently so the narrow slots are free of obstruction. The grate allows air to enter from beneath, to flow upward through whatever burns above it. By clearing it, he ensures that air can move, can feed the quiet heat that persists in the embers and the darkening kindling. He rises to his feet, brushing ash from his knees, and he moves to the small iron door set into the side of the oven. A vent that can be adjusted to control the draw of air through the firebox. The handle is cool under his fingers, and he pulls the door open another inch, feeling the slight resistance of the hinge, hearing the faint scrape of metal against metal. The adjustment is small, barely perceptible, but it changes the flow of air, allows more to enter, to move through the interior and exit through the chimney above. He kneels again before the opening. The glow inside has not changed noticeably. It remains faint, steady, a barely visible orange that emanates from beneath the kindling. He can hear the softest sound now, a faint crackling that might be wood beginning to catch, or might simply be the settling of embers, as they shift and compress under the weight of what rests above them. He rises and returns to the work table, his footsteps soft on the floor, and he stands beside the shaped loaves that rest on their cloth and board. The surfaces of the loaves are smooth in the lamplight, their forms rounded and contained. He touches one lightly with his fingertip, feeling the give of it, the way the dough yields under gentle pressure, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, returns to its shape when he removes his finger. The dough is cool to the touch, cooler than his skin, holding the temperature of the room, of the air that surrounds it. He moves to the shelf above the work table and reaches for a small pot, its iron sides darkened by repeated use. He carries it to the corner, where a tin canister sits among the jars of flour and salt. He removes the lid, the metal rasping softly against metal. Inside is ground chicory, dark and coarse, smelling faintly bitter, faintly earthy. He takes a spoonful and deposits it into the pot, the grains scattering across the bottom with a soft, dry sound. The bucket of water stands near the door, and he dips a small ceramic pitcher into it, filling the pitcher halfway before carrying it back to the pot. He pours the water over the chicory, the liquid meeting the grounds with a faint hiss, and he sets the pitcher aside. The pot is heavy in his hand as he carries it toward the oven, toward the warmth that radiates steadily from the brick surround. He sets the pot on the apron that extends from the oven mouth, positioning it near the edge where the bricks are warmest, where yesterday's heat has been absorbed and held. The iron bottom of the pot meets the brick with a soft metallic sound, and he leaves it there, turning his attention back to the oven's interior where the kindling has begun to darken further, where small flames have appeared at the edges of the wood, pale and thin, barely visible in the dim space. He waits. The pot sits on the warm brick, the water inside beginning to accept the heat that transfers slowly through iron and into liquid. There is no steam. The warmth is too gentle for that. He reaches for a thick ceramic cup that sits on the shelf beside the work table. its glaze the color of cream, its handle wide enough for his fingers to pass through comfortably. The cup is heavy, solid, cool in his hand. He carries it to the oven and stands there, waiting, his hand resting on the bricks around, feeling the warmth that emanates from within. The pot continues to warm, and he lifts it by its handle, feeling the weight of it, the warmth beginning to transfer through the metal into his palm. He pours the water into the cup. The liquid falls in a thin stream, darker now than it was, colored by the chicory that swirls through it in fine particles. He sets the pot back on the brick and lifts the cup in both hands, feeling the warmth of it through the ceramic, feeling it spread into his palms, into his fingers. He stands there holding the cup, letting the heat transfer from ceramic to skin, from liquid to air to the space around him. The dough rests on its cloth and board, the shaped loaves holding their forms in the lamplight. The oven continues its quiet warming, the kindling feeding small flames that have not yet grown, that burn with a steady, minimal presence. The lamp on its hook casts its circle of light across the work table, across the tools that wait there, across the floor where flour has settled in fine, pale dust. He lifts the cup to his lips and takes a small sip. The liquid is hot, bitter, the taste of chicory filling his mouth. He swallows, feeling the warmth move down his throat, and he lowers the cup, holding it again in both hands, letting the heat continue its transfer into his palms, while the night holds steady around him.